Just wanted to start with who RCLCO is, so you understand a little bit about us and what our point of view is. Generally speaking, we try not to have a point of view. We don't have a set agenda. When we go out and do market studies and do reports for people, we try not to have a set point of view. About 75% of the work that we do is for the private development community, and about 25% of our work is for the public sector. Just to give you a sense of, we're not out there preaching, everybody should have smart growth or density or whatever. We're pretty not biased when we do our work. So today, Patrick and I are going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about the first two, an overview of smart growth, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about, some of the national trends that are impacting the demand for smart growth. Patrick's going to talk more specifically about what we looked at for Kansas City and how does this information relate specifically to here. And then we wanted to share where we've done some of this type of work in other communities and what they're doing with that information. Generally speaking, when we think about smart growth, is to say that consumers have a big decision to make when they live, to decide where they live. And it's not that easy. Everybody's making trade-offs every day. I've lived in Atlanta in a small house that was relatively close in when I was a single person, but then I lived in an apartment. I lived in a T&D community, a traditional neighborhood design in Baldwin Park in Florida, because it was 15 minutes from my office and I could walk to work. And most recently, I just moved back to Bethesda, Maryland, where I'm able to choose a longer commute, but I got a bigger house and a bigger yard for my kids. We all have a variety of reasons that we buy houses, and there's not one size that fits all. When we talk about smart growth development, and this is from the EPA, they differ from conventional developments. The one on the right would be considered more smart growth with the grid. The one on the left with the curvilinear places, less smart growth. The main things are having a range of housing choices, so not all single-family detached, giving people viable alternatives to driving, giving them a way to walk or bike, and having a greater emphasis on a sense of place, so creating a beautiful community. I'm not going to read through all the principles here, but this is also put out from the EPA about what are the smart growth principles. Some of the highlights are mix of land use, a little bit denser, trying to be more compact, good sense of place, respecting the environment, all those nice kind of things you think about when you think about land planning and doing things in a good way. A lot of it about transportation and trying to protect the environment. What are some of the benefits of walkable urbanity? When we did this work, and we're going to talk about some work that we did in Ocala, Florida, which is a fairly rural area, they were so turned off by the word smart growth that we actually ended up using the word walkable urbanity there to kind of reflect the same thing. What we have seen is that if you put in a good place and you create a good place, that the values tend to escalate over time. And at the end, you have something that's going to last potentially longer. Higher quality of life when people can walk to different places, promoting different types of transportation choices, people being able to be independent as the country ages. This is going to be even more important when we think about our older population living out in the suburbs that's auto-dependent once they can't drive. What are their choices? More interesting places, bringing jobs and a sense of place and a third place all into the same area. And a little bit more public safety. So the more people you get in an area, the safer people tend to feel. Both Chris and Patrick are going to spend more time talking about this than I am, but this is something that we use in our work with developers a lot. When we go out and talk to them about what kind of communities do people want. This was done in 2004 and 2011. This is just the very top line. They're going to get down more into the details. The community A, you may argue that they kind of weighted it against one versus the other when I look at some of the stuff that they ask people. Single family home, large lots, no sidewalks, a longer drive, but easy parking. About 45% of people in 2004, 43% in 2011 hardly changed, but roughly half the population wants something like that. And the other half of the population wants something that's more compact, sidewalks, better transportation options. And what we found is when things are closer to people's jobs, that actually the preference for those types of communities goes up. The other thing that RCLCO does, just to kind of give you, again, that private sector side of it, is that we surveyed, and this has been going on, I've worked with RCLCO since 1998, and we've been surveying people probably since then, or the 2000s, about traditional neighborhood design communities. and have surveyed people in all these different areas, some suburban, some rural, some downtowns, and fairly consistently about 1/3 of the population has a desire to live in some type of a T&D or a smart growth product. The last thing to kind of talk about, just in that over general sense about what is smart growth, is sometimes we're also doing things on the side of commercial, looking at, what do tenants want? Where do people want to work? What are companies looking for? So I think often the smart growth conversation is reflected around people's residential choices, but we also make choices as where we work, especially Gen Y, looking for places, the youngest generation making a lot of choices about where they work and live based upon the environment. So thinking about it not just from a residential perspective, but from the office perspective as well. Some national trends, I'm not going to talk about these for very long because other folks are going to talk about it longer, but Chris in particular, I think will be talking about a number of these. But when RCLCO does work and thinks about what's going to be happening in the future, we look at all these different types of things: generational shifts, non-traditional households, migration, income and wealth. There's a lot of different things that impact the way people buy a house. This again is from that same survey data from the National Association of Realtors. The point here, and I don't want to belabor because I don't want to steal anybody else's thunder, but as we go through different life stages, we tend to make different choices in how we live. So people who are 11 to 29, Gen Y right now, the millennials, a lot of information about them. They are they are the biggest percentage of our population right now. I think it's interesting when RCLCO does this, and it's a little bit different than other people, is thinking about who's actually active in the market, who's out there renting and buying homes. So the one column, the middle column, if you will, is what percent of the population over 10 is that group. What percent of the buyers are they? So right now you can see the baby boomers and even Gen X, even though it's a smaller generation, are actually a disproportionate amount of the people who are active in the market. So when we're thinking about, trends, it's nice to think about how big Gen Y is, but a lot of them still live with their parents, is who's actually out there buying or renting. But then when you look at the preference for smart growth, and I think this is where some of their other conversation is going to be, is that the Gen Y right now in their current life stage shows a very high interest in that relative to some of the other age groups, and kind of thinking about how does that change over time. I know this is a complicated chart, and we always get sort of harassed for it, but I like it. So I will tell you quickly what it is, and it's a good way to kind of think about it. On the left-hand side is what year we're in, and the way across the top are different housing choices. Now, we all don't follow the same path as we age, but you think about going from student housing to rental housing. You rent as a couple, you buy your first home, you have a young family and you own, and I'm not implying you have kids or you don't, but even if you don't have kids, you get a dog and you buy a house. I know people who've done that. You buy your second house as your mature family, then you're an empty nester, you downsize, then you buy or rent or end up in some type of home for folks that need it as they age. So the thing that's interesting to talk about or think about is the Gen X is I don't know what color that is, moderately green. Baby boomers have had a huge impact on everything they have done as they've gone through their different life cycle. They're now at the point of, some of them are the older ones, are sort of the empty nesters just starting to retire potentially. And then there's that mature family. They still have a really big impact on our housing market. Gen X has a slightly smaller impact because of their age group, and then there's Gen Y coming up behind them. So it's thinking about as Gen Y in particular starts moving through their housing choices. And it doesn't mean that every generation is going to necessarily act the same, and not every person acts the same, but in general, as our life stage changes, we make different types of choices. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick to talk about Kansas City specifically.